The Young and the Restless Spoilers. Billy Abbott had always believed he could outrun the shadows of his past, that he could rebuild something meaningful from pieces of ambition and instinct, but the unraveling of Abbott.com proved how fragile that belief truly was. In Genoa City, nothing stayed buried for long, and certainly not when the Newman family set their sights on dismantling whatever he dared to create outside their empire. The moment whispers began circulating that Abbott.com might be gaining traction, Adam Newman sharpened his focus in the way only a Newman could: relentless, cold, and disturbingly strategic. He recognized the threat early. While Billy still saw his company as a bold venture meant to strengthen his independence, Adam saw a competitor emerging from the very family he loathed most. And Victor Newman, whose love for dominance eclipsed even paternal loyalty, was never one to ignore a threat, no matter how small. Together, they constructed a plan not merely to weaken Abbott.com but to suffocate it at its roots, quietly removing its oxygen until Billy was left scrambling for air. The first step was finding out who was bankrolling the project, and once Adam dug deep enough, the truth all but delivered itself. Jill Abbott. The one person whose endorsement could validate Billy's dream. The one investor whose influence could either protect or destroy him. And the one vulnerability Adam needed to exploit. Billy had counted on Jill's support as an unmovable foundation, a mother's belief fortified by her sharp business instincts. But Victor and Adam saw a crack. Her fear of losing everything she'd built, her unwillingness to be dragged down by another of Billy's risky ventures, and her deeply buried guilt about allowing him too many second chances. They knew that Jill cared about him, yes, but she cared more about preserving the legacy she'd spent decades constructing. And if presented with information that suggested Abbott.com was heading toward disaster, Jill would act swiftly and decisively, even if it meant sacrificing Billy. When Adam and Victor approached her, they didn't need to come with hard proof, they simply needed to plant a seed. A suggestion that Abbott.com wasn't what Billy portrayed. A hint that confidential technologies, like the controversial AI program circulating in corporate rumor mills, might be entangled in the company's foundation. A few subtle implications about legal risks, liabilities, and the possibility that Billy was once again hiding something critical. Jill had built empires and survived corporate bloodbaths, she knew when smoke meant fire. The Newmans didn't even need to fully explain. They let Jill's imagination do the rest. And it worked. The realization gutted her, because she didn't want to believe that Billy had put her assets and reputation on the line without full transparency, yet she also knew his history too well. Impulsive decisions. Emotional reactions disguised as business strategies. Risk-taking justified as vision. Jill had supported him through all of it, but Abbott.com was different. The stakes were higher, the competition more ruthless, and the margin for error almost non-existent. For the first time, she questioned whether she could stay tied to him without sinking with him. When she finally confronted Billy, her voice was calm but heavy, the way people speak when they've already made an irreversible decision. She told him the investment was too unstable, too exposed, too vulnerable to manipulation. She insisted she was pulling out, not because she didn't believe in him, but because she couldn't justify the risk with Newman Media moving aggressively to destroy everything he'd built. Billy felt the betrayal instantly, raw and sharp, as if Jill had reached into his chest and crushed the fragile hope he'd been clinging to. His mother was supposed to be the one constant in the chaos, the unshakable force that stood behind him even when the rest of the world turned its back. But the moment she withdrew, Abbott.com became a collapsing structure, a building gutted of its support beams, ready to crumble with the smallest external push. Billy spiraled, uncertain of how to salvage the company without Jill's backing. Investors were already skittish, sensing the Newman storm closing in. Rumors spread faster than truth in Genoa City, and soon Abbott.com was being viewed as a sinking ship, a risky, unstable venture with no guarantee of survival. Employees began to question their positions, partners hesitated to sign contracts, and advertisers withdrew quietly, choosing safer ground far from the Newman crossfire. Amid this chaos, Sally Spectra tried to offer empathy, or at least something resembling it. On the surface, she spoke about how deeply upset she was over her friend Audra Charles being fired due to her dark past resurfacing. But beneath the conversation lay a subtle resonance of her own fears about survival in a world where reputation meant everything. Sally knew what it was like to have your life picked apart, to be judged for your past missteps, and to watch opportunities evaporate because someone more powerful decided you were no longer useful. Her frustration over Audra's downfall mirrored Billy's panic over Abbott-Combs' collapse. And in that shared vulnerability, she recognized something devastating. Billy wasn't just losing a company. He was losing a lifeline. As Sally watched him struggle, she could see him grappling not only with financial ruin but with a deeper sense of failure that had haunted him for years. The fear that he was destined to repeat every mistake, every implosion, every collapse. The fear that Victor Newman was right, that Billy would never be more than a reckless disappointment. Every decision Billy tried to make was overshadowed by the fact that Newman Media was tightening the noose. Victor wasn't simply removing funding, he was eliminating options. He was sending a message to anyone who dared to stand with Billy: invest in him, and you will become collateral damage. Adam's involvement only intensified the pressure. With his strategic cruelty, he targeted Abbott-Combs' reputation piece by piece, leaking whispers about instability, questioning Billy's competence, and suggesting financial impropriety. He wanted Billy to feel outnumbered, cornered, and powerless. And it worked. Billy tried to salvage what he could, reaching out to alternate investors, attempting to restructure his business model, offering sweetheart deals to potential partners who weren't afraid of Newman retaliation. But every door seemed to close. Newman Media's influence spread faster than Billy's attempts at recovery. Jill's withdrawal became a signal to the entire corporate sphere that Abbott-Combs was doomed. And even those who admired Billy from a distance couldn't justify aligning themselves with a sinking endeavor. The more Billy fought, the deeper he sank into frustration, anger, and desperation. He replayed every conversation with his mother, every warning she'd ever given him about moving too fast, taking too big a gamble, ignoring the stability he desperately needed. Instead of seeing her as someone trying to protect the value of her investment, he felt the sting of abandonment. The idea that even Jill, tough, fearless, stubborn Jill, no longer believed in him was a wound that began to bleed into every decision he made. His resentment grew in silence, hidden beneath forced confidence and frantic determination. Meanwhile, Sally's frustration about Audra being fired only added fuel to the emotional chaos. She ranted about how corporations in Genoa City thrived on double standards, how the same people condemning Audra had done far worse and still held power. She saw in Billy the same injustice, a man being crushed not because he failed, but because the Newmans wanted him to. Her empathy rekindled something almost dangerous in Billy, a desire not just to save Abbott-Combs but to fight back in ways he hadn't dared before. The collapse of Abbott-Combs became more than a business failure. It became a symbolic battle for Billy Abbott's identity, his independence, and his worth. Losing the company meant validating everything Victor had ever said about him. It meant allowing Adam to win. It meant surrendering to a narrative he had spent years trying to rewrite. But as the Newmans tightened their grip, as Jill's withdrawal rippled into full-blown crisis, as Sally's frustration ignited his own, Billy found himself standing at a crossroads. He could walk away and let Abbott-Combs fade into another chapter of his long list of failures. Or he could fight harder than he ever had, pushing himself to rebuild without the safety net he'd always relied on. The chaos Newman Media created threatened to crush him, but somewhere in the rubble, there was still a spark. An ember of defiance, a flicker of the part of Billy that refused to be controlled. Whether that spark would lead to a miraculous comeback or a catastrophic downfall was still unwritten. But one thing was clear: Billy Abbott's war had just begun, and the destruction of Abbott-Combs was only the first strike in a much larger battle waiting to explode across Genoa City. Sally had always been a survivor, someone who could twist chaos into opportunity, but even she felt the crushing weight of the collapsing world around Abbott-Com as she stood face to face with Audra Charles in the dim, half-lit workspace that had once buzzed with confidence. Now it felt hollow, like a building waiting for its own obituary. When Sally finally admitted that she couldn't pay Audra for any of the work she might do, her voice was flat, defeated in a way she rarely allowed herself to sound. She tried to soften the blow, explaining that anyone tied to Abbott-Com was already swimming against a rising current, but the truth was sharper, unavoidable. Jill didn't trust Audra, not even a little, and Jill's opinion had now become law. Hearing that was a blow Audra didn't expect, even after everything she'd been through. She wasn't naive about her past. She had manipulated, lied, schemed, clawed her way into rooms she had no business entering, but she also believed she had earned a second chance. That belief shattered when she realized Jill had judged her permanently unredeemable. Audra had expected skepticism, maybe caution, but not outright rejection. The way Sally explained it felt almost clinical. Jill didn't want Audra connected to the company in any capacity, not as an employee, not as a consultant, not as a silent figure sitting in a corner with no power at all. To Jill, Audra represented volatility, scandal, instability, too much risk at a time when Abbott-Com could barely survive another whisper of controversy. Audra felt the sting of that judgment deep in her chest. Yes, she had done questionable things, but Genoa City was a place where people with far worse sins sat in boardrooms and signed multi-million-dollar deals. Victor had faked his death multiple times. Adam had committed crimes that the police still pretended not to see. Even Jack and Billy carried decades of mistakes on their backs. Yet somehow, she was the one permanently blacklisted. She wanted to scream that it wasn't fair, that if Jill truly cared about redemption, she would look at Audra's present instead of her past. But fairness had never been a currency in this town. What mattered was perception, and once someone like Jill decided you were poison, every door slammed shut forever. Sally, despite her honesty, wasn't immune to guilt. She hated being the messenger, hated even more knowing that the truth she delivered would only fuel Audra's suspicion that the entire world was rigged against her. Sally had lived that same reality once, fighting through a reputation that never fully washed off. She recognized the look in Audra's eyes, the thin line between bitterness and heartbreak, but Sally also knew Abbott-Com was hanging by a thread, and Jill's money was the only thread left. If Jill cut it, the whole structure would collapse in seconds. And Jill had made it clear, Audra was non-negotiable. So Sally did what she always did. She survived. She sacrificed someone else's dignity to protect the last shreds of her own professional stability. But the damage was immediate. Audra walked out with her shoulders stiff, chin high, but inside she felt the ground cracking beneath her. Every insult she had endured, every whispered reminder of her past, every moment she fought to prove she had changed, it all came back in one crushing wave. And Jill Abbott, with one unseen gesture from afar, had slapped a label on her that she feared she could never remove. Meanwhile, Abbott-Com itself was crumbling faster than any of them could control. Billy and Jack were locked in constant debate over strategy, over blame, over the growing dominance of Victor's interference. The conference room had become a battlefield, voices raised, tempers fraying, the pressure suffocating. They argued not only about business decisions but about responsibility, mistrust, and the unspoken fear that maybe Abbott-Com was doomed before it even began. But then the door opened, and everything shifted. Ashley Abbott returned. Her presence had always carried a certain gravity, sharp and sophisticated, and when she walked into the tense standoff between her brothers, her voice cut through the chaos like a blade. She didn't ask what was going on. She already knew. The entire town was buzzing about Victor's efforts to destroy Abbott-Com, and the infighting between Jack and Billy had become a spectacle. Instead of lecturing them, she did something even more unexpected. She ordered both of them to stop. For one day. For Thanksgiving. Ashley insisted that the company could wait, that Victor could wait, that the war could resume later. Family came first. Their sanity came first. Their unity came first. At least for one night. Billy wanted to argue, to insist that the world wouldn't pause just because they did, but Ashley's stare left no room for defiance. She had returned to pull her family back from the brink before they tore each other apart. And for a moment, it worked. They agreed. They paused. They went home. Thanksgiving night in the Abbott home carried an uneasy peace. The men kept their promise to Ashley, no plotting, no arguing, no mention of Victor Newman or Abbottcom's impending collapse. They forced themselves to breathe, to eat, to engage in something resembling normalcy. But beneath every polite conversation, beneath every reluctant smile, the same unspoken vow simmered: tomorrow, the war would resume. They would find out why Victor was so determined to destroy Abbottcom. They would uncover his strategy, expose his motives, and fight back with everything they had left. And they would not stop until they shattered whatever leverage he believed he held over them. But while Jack and Billy vowed to go after Victor, the emotional wreckage scattered around them continued to deepen. Sally was trying to convince herself she had made the right decision with Audra, but her conscience gnawed at her. She'd always prided herself on survival, but she didn't want to become someone who survived by stepping on others. Audra, on the other hand, felt her world tightening into something small and suffocating. She had lost her job, her reputation, and now the one opportunity that might have restored some stability. In her mind, Jill wasn't just rejecting her, she was erasing her. And the more Audra thought about it, the more she felt something darkening inside her, a return of old instincts she had tried desperately to bury. Meanwhile, Ashley's temporary intervention couldn't erase the truth: Abbottcom was in peril. Jill had pulled her funding. Newman Media was attacking from multiple fronts. Investors were fleeing. And Adam's involvement meant the psychological warfare was only beginning. The Abbotts would fight, but the Newmans were already winning. As Thanksgiving night faded into the cold, early hours of dawn, the fragile peace dissolved. The brothers rose to begin their hunt for answers, unaware that the fallout from Jill's rejection of Audra, Sally's difficult choice, and Ashley's brief reprieve would soon collide with the growing war against Victor Newman in ways none of them could yet imagine. Abbottcom wasn't just a company anymore, it had become the spark for a larger, more dangerous reckoning. And every member of the Abbott family, along with Sally, Audra, Jill, Adam, and Victor, was already trapped inside the firestorm that was still gathering strength in the shadows of Genoa City.